they want to belong, and that has now been achieved. Very positive news, according to Russian media and pro-Russian media in eastern Ukraine, about the turnout. For instance, in Donetsk, they're talking about 80%, and 83% in Luhansk, 63% in Kherson, and 66% in Zaporizhia. And this is the final day, as you have mentioned. Very historic day for that region, for Russia perhaps, because of the consequences, what will follow if those communities choose to join Russia. That means Russia will be annexing large parts of Ukraine. Nobody knows the consequences and the results of that as to the war, as to the world, as to Russia and Ukraine. So, I mean, it's a big day for Russia and for eastern Ukraine.
And Mohammed, what about Vladimir Putin's mobilization plan to get more recruits?
Well, apparently it's going on and it's being sped up and revamped. We just heard that one of the conscription points will be moved to the border with Georgia. That's very interesting because that's a very clogged crossing point there because of the thousands of people trying to cross to leave Russia, fleeing from the conscription. So it's very interesting that the Russians are now placing the conscription centers right at the places where there are those traffic jams and people are unable to cross, so that instead of being able to leave the country, they will be immediately taken to the front line. Russians are very unhappy with this. We have seen yesterday a man opening fire at an official in a conscription center, wounding him because he's unhappy his friend was being sent to the front. Demonstrations across the country, people crying, seeing their loved ones bust to the front line, and the government talking about mistakes in implementing this draft, because many people were rounded up who did not meet the criteria, and corrections are being made, but it is going to take time before this operation actually becomes something that will be satisfactory perhaps to both the government and the people.
Mohammed Val in Moscow, thank you. Staying with this, let's go now to Charles Stratford in Kiev. Charles, all this despite the ongoing war in Ukraine.
That's right. Heavy fighting continues along that front line at multiple places. Certainly the Ukrainians here today saying that the town of Mykolaiv in the south, that's a town about 50 kilometers north of Russian-occupied Kherson. Targets there were attacked by Russian missiles overnight. The town of Bushtan, which is actually north of Mykolaiv, they're also saying there were overnight attacks there. There are also reports, certainly according to the Ukrainians, they saying that they shot down what they describe as Iranian kamikaze drones being used by the Russians, targeting areas in the city of Odessa, the southern areas there. We spoke yesterday to the head of the regional military administration of Lugansk, a man called Sergei Hayday, and obviously we asked him the questions regarding these illegal referendums. That's what the Ukrainians, the international community and the UN are calling them, and asked him whether in fact that changed anything in terms of military strategy, anything on the ground. He said absolutely not. He did appeal, though, to what's understood to be hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians in these occupied areas. He said that they should stay away from potential military targets. He described the partial mobilization by Putin of these, what's expected to be potentially up to 300,000 troops going down on the Russian side to the front, again as being a sham. He said that we have already dealt, in his words, with the professional Russian army. We will now deal with the amateur army. He described these men as being potentially cannon fodder. We've also been trying to monitor and look at pictures coming out of the occupied territories in some of these areas where these referendum, these voting is ongoing. Very difficult, as you can imagine, to verify some of the sound, some of the interviews coming out. But it's been very interesting to see the Russian media sometimes struggling to get people to talk to them in those areas. But as you can imagine, a lot of people there that they've got on camera saying that they were happy to vote, and they have voted for Russia. As I say, it's believed, certainly with respect to the Lugansk region alone, around 300,000 people had left that area in the build-up to the war, and as the war started, it's understood that there are around 350,000 still there. Yes, many of them may have pro-Russian sympathies and may be voting yes to this, what is understood to be an eventual annexation, potentially, of up to 15% of Ukrainian territory, an area around 90,000 square kilometres, an area the size of a country like Hungary or Portugal. But yeah, a lot of these people still there and sympathetic to Russia, but in no way, certainly according to the Ukrainians, is this vote legitimate and represents any real kind of guide on what the people living in those occupied territories really want.
In Kiev for us, Charles, thank you for that. Colombia and Venezuela have reopened their borders to cargo, potentially enabling billions of dollars in trade after a years-long closure. Well, people along the shared border hope it will boost the economy. Alessandro Rampietti reports from the Colombian border town of Cúcuta.
Adorned with flags from both countries, the first cargo trucks crossed the border between Colombia and Venezuela after years of political conflict. It's a highly symbolic moment as delegations from both governments met in the middle of the Simón Bolívar Bridge. Colombia's new left-wing president, Gustavo Petro, had made the reopening of the border a key campaign promise.
Creo que hoy es un día histórico.
I think today is a historic day for the region, for the country, for South America. Globalization is first and foremost a relationship between neighbors. Anyone who measures the flows of trade, cultural exchange and population movement will always find that the greatest amount is between neighbors. That is how it was here before sectarian madness took over hearts and brains.
The first trucks crossing from Colombia were loaded with toilet paper, plastic and medical supplies, the one from Venezuela with rolls of aluminium.
The Petro administration believes that trade between the two countries will reach $1 billion by the end of the year, and possibly $4 billion by the end of his administration 4 years from now. And they hope that most will benefit the millions of people that live along the border.
Hopefully this will help with the shortages in Venezuela and reduce contraband and the extortions we were subjected to cross. I think it will make life easier.
Relations between the two countries had reached rock bottom in 2019, when former Colombian President Iván Duque spearheaded efforts to force regime change in Venezuela. The shutdown worsened security along the border, emboldening crime gangs that control smuggling and drug trafficking. Local entrepreneurs say the border should never have been shut.
It's been 7 years without vehicles passing through here, greatly affecting the cultural, social and economic reality of the region. Millions of people had to rely on dangerous crossing, ending up victims of violence and disappearing. But what's coming is a different border that will hopefully generate employment for all.
But while the reopening is a welcome first step, everybody here agrees much more needs to be done to overcome the economic, security and humanitarian crisis affecting this border region. Alessandro Rampietti, Al Jazeera, Cúcuta.
Still ahead on Al Jazeera, calls for justice in Mexico as protesters mark 8 years since 43 students went missing. And in France, some companies are returning to a centuries-old way of moving cargo to become more environmentally friendly.
Anticipation is rising, and so is the atmosphere. Are you ready? The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Hello, we have a proper taste of autumn across a good part of Europe now. Lots of clouds showing up, showers rattling in across many parts. We've got some wetter weather streaming through. Winds coming in from a northwesterly direction across British Isles and the island of Ireland, digging some showers all the way down into central parts. We're hanging on to the heat down towards that southeastern corner, but elsewhere it does look rather cool and rather showery and rather blustery too. So we've got some wetter weather up towards the northwest, still some very heavy rain there into southern parts of Norway, sliding across into Sweden. Those showers, they come right down across the Low Countries, Germany, through eastern parts of France, turning to snow over the Alps. A little bit of wet weather too, just around the Pyrenees, and quite a brisk wind even here, rolling in across the Bay of Biscay. These showers become a little more lively as we go on into Wednesday. 12 Celsius there in Zurich, 15 in London and Paris. It won't feel as warm as that when you add on the strength of that wind. A few blustery showers too into central parts of the Mediterranean. You might just catch a shower too into northern areas of Algeria, pushing across towards Tunisia. Better chance of seeing showers across Central Africa, of course. We've seen some rather heavy rain into the Gulf of Guinea. They are, of course, sinking further southwards, but looking very wet for Sierra Leone.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Debating the issues of the day.
Drug use has always been criminalized around the boundaries of race.
These aren't just numbers, they're people, they're our families and our friends and our community members.
On air or online, add your voice.
This military don't believe in dialogue. The political crisis must be solved with the political solution.
As climate change progresses, there are some people who are in places that they're just going to have to move. There's no recognition about what we're already facing.
The Stream on Al Jazeera.
You're watching Al Jazeera. A reminder of our top stories this hour. Tributes have been paid to Japan's former leader Shinzo Abe at a rare state funeral. Abe was assassinated in July while campaigning ahead of parliamentary elections. But many people in Japan are unhappy about the funeral, largely due to the cost. The government says it's spending nearly $12 million. It's the fifth and final day of referendums in separatist-held regions of Ukraine. Votes on whether to join Russia are being held in the Donetsk and Luhansk republics in the east, and Kherson and Zaporizhia in the south. In India, protests are being held over the death of a 15-year-old student allegedly beaten by his teacher. Demonstrations turned violent in the state of Uttar Pradesh. The boy belonged to the Dalit community that are discriminated against under the Hindu caste hierarchy. The teacher has not been found, and it belongs to a community regarded as upper caste. Pavni Mittal reports from New Delhi.
There is growing anger against casteism and caste-based violence in India. Last evening, violent protests broke out in a city in northern India over the boy's death. The family says that the boy was beaten by his teacher a few weeks ago for making a spelling error. Now, the family has called this a caste-based hate crime. This family is from the lowest caste in the Hindu caste system, the social hierarchical system. This community is often treated as untouchables. Now, untouchability in India is banned but remains rampant. The police have filed a complaint against the teacher, who they say is absconding. You know, this comes as hate crimes like these have become more common and have been in the news more often. According to government data, about 5 caste-based hate crimes take place every hour on average in the country. Now, India does have strict and stringent laws against crimes like these. In fact, a few years ago, some of these laws were even strengthened. But activists say that enforcement remains weak. We've also seen members of this community mobilize and assert their rights increasingly over the last few years. But their efforts have often been met with more discrimination and, as in incidents like these, more violence.
Tens of thousands of people have rallied in Mexico City to mark the 8th anniversary of the disappearance of 43 students. Well, families of the victims demonstrate each year to push the government into solving the case. The group was kidnapped in 2014. John Holman has more from the rally in Mexico City.
There must be tens of thousands of people that are marching down Mexico's main avenue, Paseo de la Reforma, and they're here because it's the 8th anniversary of an event that shocked Mexico and continues to reverberate around the country when 43 students were disappeared on a rainy night in Iguala in the southwest of the country, and their parents, their family members and many others still campaign for justice on their behalf. This is what one of the fathers of the disappeared told us about that campaign for justice and where it's at right now.
I'm disappointed, that's the word, as a father, because while the government was campaigning, they committed to deal with this. And those words are just hot air. We know the government had the political will to do something, but that will has disappeared.
What he's talking about is the fact that this government said that they were going to get to the bottom of this, that they were going to solve it after an investigation by the previous administration that was denounced in the end as a complete cover-up. But that original impetus seems to be dying a bit. Political factors may have got in the way. Arrest warrants that were asked for have now, by the same Attorney General's office, reportedly being cancelled, that would have gone after some powerful people. And this is really sobering, the fact that this case of the 43 students with all of its problems is actually probably the one in which there's been most pressure on authorities to solve it. There's more than 100,000 people that have disappeared in this country, and many of them, the families, say that they simply search alone. We talked to a brother of another disappeared people who's on this march in solidarity.
My brother disappeared on the 4th of July 2014 in plain daylight outside a secondary school. And all of these people have a relative that has disappeared, a brother, a son. We're here showing our support for the parents of the students. We empathize because we've lived through the same thing.
As the violence continues in Mexico, and it hasn't really shown any sign of slowing down, there's inevitably going to be more cases like the 43 students who disappeared, other cases, other families who have also lost their loved ones, and more people across this country searching for their relatives, trying to find them dead or alive.
For centuries, sailing ships were the only means of moving cargo around the globe until they were replaced by fuel-powered vessels. Well, today, international shipping is one of the world's most polluting industries. So some companies are reviving wind power to transport goods in a more environmentally friendly way. Natasha Butler reports.
In northwestern France, the Avon sailing ship is an impressive sight. The boat is more than a century old, but very much turned towards the future. It uses only wind power to carry cargo on journeys that are largely free of carbon emissions and pollution.
We started this because we saw the need for clean transport, clean sea transport, and then we also want to draw the attention to our consumerism, the way we consume goods. The way we consume goods requires large amounts of ships that carry, well, in my eyes, useless stuff. And that creates a lot of pollution for the Earth, which is absolutely unnecessary. So we want to offer an alternative.
Global shipping accounts for 3% of the world's annual carbon emissions. The industry has set a target of halving them by 2050. Olivier Tanguy says wind power could be part of the solution. He works for a French company that's building one of the world's biggest cargo sailing ships.
Lots of ideas have been considered by the big shipping companies, like attaching a big sail to container ships or using LNG, but none of them have come up with something workable, like the sailing ship that we are building.
Demand for wind-powered transportation is growing. An increasing number of companies are signing up to have their goods carried by sailing ships because it is good for the planet, but it's also good for business. In eastern France, the country's only carbon-neutral champagne producer uses electric machinery and sustainable methods.
And we use 80% of recycled glass, which uses less energy to melt.
Michel Drapier transformed his generations-old estate because he's passionate about the environment. He'll soon use sailboats to ship his champagne to clients abroad.
It's more expensive to carry the wine that way, but I'm sure that some consumers, a majority of consumers in the future, will appreciate the fact that the transportation doesn't produce any carbon.
Sailing boats are unlikely to replace container ships soon, as they're slower and can't carry as much. But as energy prices soar and concern over climate change grows, they could help the shipping industry to change tack. Natasha Butler, Al Jazeera, Douarnenez, northwestern France.
NASA has deliberately smashed a spacecraft into an asteroid, and the world watched it happen in real time. It was all done in the name of humanity's survival. Rob Reynolds explains.
11 million kilometers from Earth, the spacecraft hurtled closer and closer to the rocky asteroid that was its target. And then, bullseye. Scientists and engineers at Mission Control cheer as the spacecraft smashes into a far-off asteroid called Dimorphos. It's a key step toward defending the world from future devastating impacts by massive space rocks.
We are showing that planetary defense is a global endeavor, and it is very possible to save our planet.
NASA's Double Asteroid Redirection Test, or DART, was launched in November last year. Its entire mission was to ram into Dimorphos at a speed of more than 6 kilometers per second, or 3,600 kilometers an hour. The result, it's hoped, a gentle nudge pushing the asteroid on a new path. Over many years, the change in trajectory will grow larger. While Dimorphos itself is not on a course to collide with Earth, space rocks, like the one that flashed across the sky in Russia 9 years ago, hit the planet all the time. And the big ones can change the course of life on Earth. 65 million years ago, a huge object crashed near the Yucatan Peninsula, causing global devastation. Scientists believe the impact is directly linked to the extinction of the dinosaurs. Getting rid of T-Rex and their kin was a good thing for us mammals, but another collision of the same magnitude won't be. It could destroy us all. So the international consortium behind DART hopes to defend the Earth from potential catastrophe by combining careful observations to identify asteroid threats years or decades ahead of time, along with the ability to knock them off their collision course.
There are no known asteroid threats. But when we find one in the future, maybe we'll have the technologies to potentially prevent it.
Dimorphos' new trajectory will be studied for years to come. The information gleaned from the test will, hopefully, help prevent humanity from suffering the same fate as the dinosaurs. Rob Reynolds, Al Jazeera.
Now, the little-known pangolin is the world's most illegally trafficked mammal. The World Wildlife Fund estimates more than 1 million of the creatures have been trafficked in a decade. But some conservationists are dedicating their lives to rehabilitating them in South Africa. Emily Angwin reports.
This South African pangolin is nicknamed Bumper. He was confiscated during an undercover operation and is one of many brought to vet Debbie English.
So a lot of people, first of all, don't know they exist, and they don't really understand how endangered these little animals are.
By the time they get to this clinic, the pangolins are in desperate need of medical treatment.
More often than not, they are emaciated, dehydrated, and most of them have pneumonia when we receive them.
The animals are kept in appalling conditions before they're traded on the black market. They're left in car boots, bags and plastic drums for days or even weeks. One pangolin can fetch up to $15,000. Their meat and scales, which are made of keratin, are used in traditional African and Asian medicine.
It's the most traded of the illegal wildlife animals currently, and that's it's taken over from the rhinos in a big way.
This undercover agent for the African Pangolin Working Group poses as a buyer.
And once we've put the deal together, we'll set up a time and location where we do the transaction. And this is where the sting operation will go down.
Wildlife traffickers face up to 10 years in prison in South Africa. The pangolins are confiscated and taken to a rehabilitation centre at a secret location.
It takes a long time medically to get them back into a position where we can release them. So some animals are here for a month and then some nearly a year.
It's a labour-intensive process.
The challenge with rehabilitating these animals is not just the enormous cost that's involved, but it's also the time that's required. South African pangolins won't eat in captivity, and so they need to forage for food for up to 6 hours a day. Emma De Jager has a team of staff and volunteers. And while getting them back into the wild is the ultimate goal, conservationists say it's not enough.
In every one that we save and the time that we save that, hundreds and thousands are being poached in that time. We're not talking a matter of 10 years they'll be extinct, we're talking a year. They are shy and secretive, they don't hurt anybody, but yet we're destroying them.
The clinic receives no government funding. The undercover agent also works for free.
It's for each and every person, every citizen, every person to actually protect the wildlife, because we are protecting it not for ourselves but for our future generations.
As for Bumper, he's been released back into the wild. One of the few success stories in this campaign to save the pangolin. Emily Angwin, Al Jazeera, Zanin, South Africa.
This is Al Jazeera, and these are the main stories now. Japan's former leader, Shinzo Abe, has been honoured in a rare state funeral, with world leaders joining Prime Minister Fumio Kishida in paying tributes. Abe was assassinated in Nara in July while campaigning ahead of parliamentary elections. But many people in Japan are unhappy about the funeral, largely due to the cost. The government says it's spending nearly $12 million. Rob McBride has the latest from Tokyo.
Fumio Kishida, the current Prime Minister, has led the condolences, offering his own tribute to Shinzo Abe. It was his controversial decision to go ahead with this state funeral, and it has proved to be extremely unpopular, and a lot of polling that has been taken. But he paid tribute to Shinzo Abe, saying that he should have lived a lot longer, saying that he was a compass for both Japan and the world. He reminded the gathering, and there are well over 4,000 people, including many dignitaries and VIPs from around the world, that they had actually entered Parliament together as young MPs. And he said that not seeing him ever again was both, he said, regrettable and heartbreaking.
It's the fifth and final day of referendums in separatist-held regions of Ukraine. Votes on whether to join Russia are being held in the Donetsk and Luhansk republics in the east, and Kherson and Zaporizhia in the south. Protests have turned violent in the Indian state of Uttar Pradesh over the death of a 15-year-old student allegedly beaten by his teacher. The boy belonged to the Dalit community that is discriminated against under the Hindu caste hierarchy. The teacher has not been found and belongs to a community regarded as upper caste. There have been a series of beatings and incidents of rape targeting the Dalit community in India in recent weeks. And strong winds and heavy rain from Hurricane Ian have arrived in Cuba. Officials have evacuated thousands of people from their homes and are working to protect properties. Those are the headlines. The news continues here on Al Jazeera. That's after the stream. Do stay with us.
Bosnia and Herzegovina is going to the polls amid a dispute over election reforms that would enable people to vote along ethnic lines at all levels of government, right up to the presidency. As Bosnian Serbs challenge state institutions in their escalating bid for succession, and Croats warn of the consequences if the vote is held under the current law, what does the future hold for this fragile democracy? Bosnia elections on Al Jazeera.
Listening to are pressure waves from a galaxy cluster known as Perseus, about 240 million light years away from Earth. NASA's Black Hole remix recently went viral online, and it's fueling more and more interest in black hole science, as well as its mysteries. Hi, I'm Ahmed Shahabuddin. I can imagine, like me, you have a lot of questions, so jump into today's YouTube chat and you can be part of this discussion. A black hole is believed to be the most extreme environment in the universe, an area in space where the force of gravity is so intense, not even light can escape. But how much do scientists really know about black holes and what their actual purpose is? Well, joining us today In Connecticut, Priyamvada Nadarajan, a professor of astronomy and physics at Yale University and one of the principal investigators with Harvard University's Black Hole Initiative. In the U.S. state of Rhode Island, Kimberly Arcand, a data visualizer and science communicator for NASA's Chandra X-ray Observatory. And in New York State, Jehan Kartaltepe, an astrophysicist at the Rochester Institute of Technology, where she studies the evolution and formation of galaxies. Thank you so much for being with us beyond feeling very unaccomplished after all those introductions. No, I'm joking. So many interesting burning questions here, really, but let's start with the most fundamental. Kimberly, what is a black hole?
Well, I think a black hole is a really cool thing, and it's a really interesting thing and a thing of mystery. But in essence, I like to think of them as a dense, compact object whose gravitational pull is so strong that within a certain distance of it, nothing, not even light, can escape. And many of the black holes that we sort of know and love, I guess, are thought to be the result from the collapse of a very, very, very massive star as it sort of gets towards the end of its stellar evolution.
That's a simple explanation that I can understand. I want to ask you, though, Priya, you know, when we talk about black holes, there's a lot of misconceptions. There's a lot of maybe confusion of what it exactly is. So they certainly seem to help us understand how our galaxy kind of was shaped and formed. But what fascinates you most about it?
Well, I guess as Kim just mentioned, right? So you can think of the black hole as a place of extreme gravity from which nothing can escape. And there is this region, sort of like a sacred boundary, if you will, called the event horizon. So once you cross the event horizon, nothing, no matter, not even light, can escape. So what happens inside the event horizon is something that we don't quite understand. We're starting to understand it and figure it out. But we know that the black hole actually encases a point that we call a singularity. This is where all our knowledge of physics breaks down. So for me, the fascination with black holes is that they represent the edge, sort of the limits of knowledge, right? And so trying to understand them, like you're literally pushing knowledge and our minds as much as we possibly can.
Well, I mean, that's certainly fascinating to me. I mean, my dad's a physicist. He spent much of his life trying to explain some of this stuff to me. I don't know that I got it, but that certainly it makes sense to me. I mean, so when you say singularity, that's the center of the black hole. This is where we don't have sort of the physics knowledge to really understand what's going on. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right. So our understanding, all our laws, right? Nature has all these laws, these symmetries, and everything kind of breaks down when we approach the singularity.
Interesting, fascinating. Jehan, when we talk about sort of galaxies and how they've evolved, I know a lot of your research focuses on this. We have people in our live YouTube chat right now actually asking some pretty pointed questions I want to share with you. One of them says, do black holes lead to higher dimensions? And maybe the most interesting one to me from Solid Cancer says, can you have 2 or 3 black holes that have joined together or merged?
That's a great question. So my research focuses on galaxies themselves and how they form and evolve over time. But I'm especially interested in what happens when 2 galaxies merge together. And we think that all galaxies have these supermassive black holes in their center. So when those galaxies merge and become one, those black holes should also merge and become one. And just recently, we got evidence of this process through the gravitational wave detections by LIGO.